This is still very strange, right? Because if we believe that Jesus was God's son and God sent him to earth,
I most certainly do.
Right. So that happened about 2,000 years ago, right? And yet the world still has all of this suffering. So here's this supposedly all-powerful being who created the universe and everything, and who doesn't like the suffering that goes on, and who tried to do something about it 2,000 years ago, and yet the suffering is still going on. Doesn't seem to be really better. So it seems like he's a bungler. He made a bad mistake in thinking that sending his son to be crucified would somehow fix all the suffering in the world, and it plainly hasn't.
Well, actually, Richard Weikart, and one of the things that Richard pushed you on was interesting. He pushed you on the sort of famous is-ought dilemma in ethics, and you said something to the effect of, I should have written it down, I was driving in the car at the time, so I wasn't able to take the notes, so I had to remember the gist of what you said, but you said something to the effect of, I've spent most of my career trying to avoid the is-ought kind of issue, but then it was interesting, again, preparing for today, ought-based language is all over your work.
There's nothing wrong with ought-based language.
I ought to do X.
Of course.
Well, let me put this question to you in that sense then, Peter. So you believe in moral agency. You believe in that there is a right and wrong way to act with respect to other people and the whole of the living world. I think for many people, like Andy would say, but where does that sense of moral duty come from, and what's it grounded in ultimately? Why should someone act in the best way they can towards, why should someone adopt a utilitarian principle when they could simply say, well, I don't want to do that? In a universe where there is a God, where there is potentially some sort of moral arbiter, some kind of moral lawgiver, one may be able to find a way to saying, well, that's where this duty, this oughtness about the universe comes from. In a universe where there is no God, I think a lot of people ask, well, what is that grounded in? How can we get to this sense that we should act in certain ways?
But let's go back to the claim that in a universe in which there is a God, then it's grounded. Are we to say it's grounded simply in the will of God, in the arbitrary will of God? This is an argument, of course, that goes right back to Plato. Mm-hmm. Are we to say that if God had willed that, in fact, we cut up babies and eat them on the barbecue, then that would have been the right thing to do? Because I certainly wouldn't want to believe that, and I don't know whether Andrew wants to believe that. But if you reject that, then you have to say it's not arbitrary that God tells us that it's wrong to torture babies and that it's better to be kind to them, because that reflects a more basic underlying truth. And if there is such a more basic underlying truth that it's better not to, let's say, gratuitously cause pain, then that's something that we have access to and that can ground our action.
And is independent of God. So you seem to be stating Euthyphro's dilemma there, this idea that it's either...
You're right. You picked up the reference well.
But essentially, yes, does God command the good because it's good, or is the good what we should do independent of what God commands? This is a common response to the so-called moral argument.
And it was interesting because Peter's so prolific, I refreshed my memory because I think the edition of Practical Ethics on my shelf was like an early one, perhaps not first edition, but I bought the more recent one on Kindle, and I'd forgotten. Of course, you had a reference in there early on to the Euthyphro dilemma. Slightly disappointed that you don't do much engagement with the literature, because of course, as many people have pointed out, the answer to the Euthyphro dilemma is actually found in Plato himself. Because when Plato is positing that dilemma, he is using the word God and the gods really to describe the gods of Greek mythology, who are very much largely creatures within creation, very much physical. They're physical beings. And then, of course, Plato puts forward the idea of the good, which in English we would probably tend to render that with a capital T and a capital G, who really is the kind of sort of metaphysical standard of goodness. It is the good. And Christian theists have always, generally since Augustine, connected those two, going, well, that's what Christian theism is talking about. It's not that God goes, well, what shall I command? Let's have some fun and command this. Or God looking to some standard outside of himself. But God is goodness. And therefore,
but for Plato, it's not a personal good. The good is not personal. Whereas
no, I agree.
Presumably for Christians it is.
I would absolutely agree with you there. I think that's the difference.
So if I don't think, I won't exactly accept Plato's metaphysics, but I could, let's say, well, yes, there is something that is objectively the good, and if you like, it always is there and it always would be there, has the potential to be there. So I could say it's timelessly true that to gratuitously inflict pain is a bad thing. But that doesn't get you anywhere in terms of saying there's a God, because this is not a personal being.
No, and that's a good question, though. I mean, I would say a couple of things there, Peter. One is interesting. I forget where I read, but I read a recent interview with you where you made a comment to the effect of that you're just beginning to sort of nudge towards the idea that there may be standards of objective goodness.
Oh, I accept that. You're a few years out of date.
Yes. Well, it's not so much that. I read so much in the last... Okay. I think it was in the interview you did in 2016 with the Journal of Applied Ethics was where you were quoted as saying that. And I think that's interesting because actually I don't think you can avoid that. For example, Jeremy Bentham both of them had the same issue. He ultimately had to admit the utility principle you can't really give reasons for. You have to take it as a foundation, which is interesting that you raise Plato, because I really think you're forced with two choices. You either have to posit a kind of personal God like the God of Christian theism, or this sort of Platonic realm of things such as, moral duties and those kind of things that are external to us and objective to us. They're discovered, and that was a question you raised at the start.
Well,
Justin.
I wanted to ask, because
Yes.
I think it's important to get to this point. So you do believe at some level, Peter, in the idea of objective moral values and duties.
Yes.
And those things exist independently of us, in a sense, in our evolutionary history and that.
Yes, the word exist is could be misinterpreted, but perhaps you could say in a similar way to mathematical truths existing. And again, there's a lot of discussion among philosophers as to how you understand mathematics. But
and in that sense, then,
true
rather than us inventing the things that we think are good, they actually exist independent of us. We discover them in that sense. And obviously, that seems to cohere, many would say, with Christian theism, the idea that there is a God who has, as it were, woven this into the fabric of the reality that we live in. But it's harder to reconcile with naturalism, which I assume is you do.
I'm not a naturalist.
You're not a naturalist.
I'm
okay,
not
well, what are you?
I'm not a naturalist in the ethical sense.
Okay.
Right? I can describe myself as a naturalist in terms of understanding the universe, broadly speaking.
I see.
But not in every respect, perhaps.
Where does the realm then, if it exists, where is it?
When we're talking about ethics, naturalism is the idea that Andrew referred to before, that you can derive ought judgments from is judgments. In other words, that you can go from facts to values. I don't think that's true. I think that there are independent normative truths, which, as I say, I'm a little doubtful about saying they exist, if that suggests that in some sense there is a realm where these things could be discovered or seen. But I think that they're something that we have access to, as we have access to principles of logic or principles of mathematics. That if we're rational beings, we can understand them. And
That's interesting, because I meet many atheists who deny that altogether.
Yes, there's another view, which I did hold for a good bit of my career, which says that essentially when we make moral judgments, we're expressing attitudes, and these attitudes are not really true or false, or sometimes people say prescriptions. My former Oxford teacher, R.M. Hare, said that they're prescriptions, that we're prescribing things, which again are not true or false. Just as if I say to you, shut the window, that's not true or false. It's a command. It's not a description. It's not like saying the window is shut. So that is another possible position that many philosophers hold.
The claim that we need God to be moral doesn't hold up. Plato destroyed that idea thousands of years ago. If something is good just because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary. If God commanded something horrific, would that suddenly make it good? No one actually believes that. But if God commands things because they're already good, then goodness exists independently of God. That means you don't need him to ground morality. And science backs this up. Yale studies show babies prefer helpful characters before they're taught religion. Empathy and fairness show up in primates too. That's biology. That's evolution. We don't need a supernatural lawgiver to know causing unnecessary suffering is wrong. We have reason. We have empathy. That's enough.
What's led you to the belief that actually there really is this objective realm of moral values and duties?
For a long time, I tried to reconcile the non-objectivist, if you like, the prescriptivist view with the idea that reason plays a role in reaching ethical conclusions. And I tried to do that broadly within the framework that R.M. Hare had set out. But eventually I concluded that couldn't really be done. And at the same time, I was persuaded by a number of philosophers. Derek Parfit is one who's been influential with me, Tim Scanlon, Tom Nagel, that it's reasonable to think that there are normative truths that are objective, that we don't have to go into any really weird metaphysics in order to accept that.
So we don't live in a world where we're all beholden to basically whatever anyone's opinion is on their particular morality. It's not subjective in this. We can say,
right.
if you're behaving wrongly, you ought to be behaving this way.
We can certainly say that, and I'd go further and say, in saying that, we're not just expressing our own attitude, like we're saying, I really like a lot of garlic in my spaghetti sauce, and someone else says, no, I don't like garlic. We're talking about something where there is a right or wrong answer.
So why for you should this make Peter at least open to the possibility of theism, Andy, rather than a sort of whatever maybe Platonic realm.
Well, I want to say a couple of things before that, Justin. I mean, the first thing I want to say is I want to be very careful because in the context of this being a collegial discussion, it's very tempting for both Christians and for atheists to sort of try and find gotcha moments and go, I've just got Peter admitting. And I want to be careful in doing that. What I want to then say as well, I also respect, I think, how Peter arrived at that position, because I think if you do say that ethical statements have sort of no content, they're meaningless. I mean, that was something sort of right out of the whole sort of annals of logical positivism and A.J. Ayres and others. We end up with a very strange counterintuitive conclusion that somebody who decides they prefer helping the poor and giving lots of money away to help people in difficult parts of the world, that's no different from somebody who decides they want to, invade Eastern Europe and try and, start the Third Reich. And there's no difference between them. And that's so counterintuitive, something's got to be wrong with it. I also want to say as well that I think the other thing I think that's interesting around ethics is ethics requires grounding in a framework. I don't think you can do ethical statements like you could do mathematics. Ethics belongs in the context of relationships, and that's sometimes why ethicists go wrong. They kind of abstract things from the context of family and community and interpersonal relationships and try and sort of analyse them logically. And I think on this bigger question, the metaphysics behind it, the same applies. I don't think you can abstract ethics from some kind of bigger framework. Where I think things do get interesting, and where if I were on Peter's side of the table, I would at least be sort of scratching my head slightly, I think, is that if one is not careful, you do end up with, I forget which philosopher sort of coined this phrase, you end up with a sort of extravagant Platonism, that you have this realm, wherever you put it, in which we have moral values and duties, mathematical objects, other abstract objects, and it sort of grows and grows and grows and is full of these things, rather than for Christian theism to go, well, okay, we actually only have one sort of metaphysical object, as it were, which is God, and those things are grounded in the mind of God. Not least that's helpful because moral commandments do follow, but moral duties do follow between people. And so rather than thou shalt not murder floating around abstractly out in the void, doing nothing until human beings have evolved to such a point that suddenly it applies to them in the same way as the law of gravity applies to them, actually we have a divine person, and duties and so forth follow between persons. I think there's something around that intrigues me.
Why does that not follow for you, that these duties and moral values should be grounded in something, I suppose, beyond ourselves in the form of God, ultimately?
Well, to answer that, we would have to get back to questions about whether there are reasons for us to believe that God exists. And especially as we're talking about morality and the claim that morality is grounded in the existence of God or the will of God, I do think you have to look at the world around you and you have to say there is an immense amount of suffering that goes on, which I don't believe an all-powerful, omniscient and good, morally good being would permit. Because this is not simply suffering that occurs to those who do bad things. It's not even if you were to believe what I think is a repellent doctrine of original sin, that all humans have sinned because Adam and Eve sinned, and therefore it's okay for us to be punished. Because even if you accept that, non-human animals not being descended from Adam would not have original sin, and yet it's clear that they suffer, and not only at the hands of humans. They suffer because I come from Australia. There's seasonal droughts. Out there in the arid centre of Australia, there are droughts, and many kangaroos and other animals will slowly die of thirst, a miserable death. I cannot for the life of me see why a good God would permit that. So
really, the fact that you can't place these moral duties and values in the framework of God is because there are other aspects of God that you just find can't bring you.
That's certainly a major reason for me. I mean, Andrew objected to extravagant Platonism and seemed to imply that belief in a God is somehow less extravagant. We could have a debate about what creates more metaphysical extravagance, and that would be another issue that we could raise. And also, I still haven't really heard Andrew's answer to the question of whether God is simply, whether the things that God says are good, they could have been different or not. I haven't. I know he said it's something part of the idea of goodness, but then.
Well, let's send this back to you, Andy, because absolutely. I think there's a couple of questions there.
There are.
This challenge over whether you can resolve Euthyphro's dilemma and whether God actually does command the good and so on, but also the problem of suffering. Peter says God's not even on the table as long as the world we're in is the world that God has created, because I can't reconcile that with a God of love as you seem to be able to.
There's a lot of good things in there, but let's take that latter one, Peter, because I think that's a hugely significant question. And of course, as a philosopher who is no slouch, you'll be aware that there's a whole branch of philosophy that deals with that from a range of perspective, which is the whole branch of philosophy and theology known as theodicy. So I think it'd be interesting to do some digging into that if one's going to use that as an argument. What I find interesting is right from the word go that actually that brings a whole moral dimension to bear on the world that we live in, because of course our instinctive reaction hopefully our instinctive reaction, whether it's kangaroos dying of thirst in the centre of Australia, or whether it's a hurricane or whatever causing some kind of natural disaster, is we don't just view it coldly and dispassionately. We actually bring the ought to bear. It ought not to be like that. The world ought to be different, and that oughtness, as somebody once described, is a bit like the bubble on the wallpaper. You wallpaper a room and there's a bubble over here, and you push it down and it pops up over here. We can't seem to avoid making those kind of value judgments. Now, if that was all there was to say, then I think if the Christian story was simply God is good and has created this world, and hey, isn't it wonderful? Then I think we'd have every duty to come along and go, well, hang on just a moment. But of course, that's neither the beginning of the story nor the end of the story. The beginning of the story is that something has gone wrong with creation. With all due respect, Peter, you slightly mischaracterise the Christian doctrine of original sin, which is not the reason the world is in the state it's in, is because God goes, because of Adam and Eve, I'm just going to kill those kangaroos, unless that's that's the AV, the Australian version.
Tell me what the right version is.
Rather than that's actually fundamentally twisted and broken creation, both our relationship with God and creation itself.
But if God is all powerful, why can't he fix it?
If God is all powerful, all knowing, and perfectly good, why is the world like this? We're not talking about minor inconvenience. We're talking about children with cancer. We're talking about animals slowly dying in droughts. Peter Singer's point is simple. That level of suffering doesn't line up with an all-powerful, morally perfect being. And this isn't just human evil. Kangaroos dying of thirst in Australia didn't sin. They didn't rebel. Natural disasters, disease, parasites. This has been happening for millions of years, long before humans existed. So either God can't stop it, which means he's not all-powerful, or he can stop it and doesn't, which means he's not all good. You can't dodge that with abstract philosophy. If morality comes from a perfect God, the world should reflect that. It doesn't.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Before I get to that, I'd also point out, interestingly, I don't know if you're aware of, one of our most iconoclastic atheist philosophers here in the UK is John Gray, formerly London School of Economics. And John, either in his book Heresies or in Straw Dogs, I always forget which one this is found in, talks about the doctrine of original sin and the fall, and says, much as I disagree with much that Christians have said, he said, that's actually the one thing I think Christianity has got right. Just look around you. Human beings are a badly broken animal. Now, your question about why does God allow it? Well, if God had simply sat there in heaven and done nothing about it, then I think we would be able to raise that very charge of going, well, it's all right for you. You're sitting up there in heaven. Life is pretty miserable down here. But of course, the whole of the Christian story is what God has and is doing about it in and through the cross and through Jesus. And whatever you make of Jesus of Nazareth, certainly the heart of the Christian story, you have the ability to go, the one thing you cannot pin on the God of the Bible is this is not a God who knows something, who knows nothing about suffering and injustice. And interestingly, Justin, that brings us full circle. Because one of the things I would also want to bring to the table as a Christian about human value and dignity is that value is also conferred by what somebody is prepared to pay. And in the God of the Bible, and then the cross and in Jesus, you have God making a tremendous statement about the value of human beings, such that he will be willing to go through that in the person of Jesus.
This is still very strange, right? Because if we believe that Jesus was God's son and God sent him to earth...
I most certainly do.
Right, so that happened about 2,000 years ago, right? And yet the world still has all of this suffering. So here's this supposedly all-powerful being who created the universe and everything, and who doesn't like the suffering that goes on, and who tried to do something about it 2,000 years ago, and yet the suffering is still going on. Doesn't seem to be really better. So it seems like he's a bungler. He made a bad mistake in thinking that sending his son to be crucified would somehow fix all the suffering in the world, and it plainly hasn't.
Well, actually, if I was going to be wonderfully sort of cheeky, I'd go, actually, Stephen Pinker was sitting in that chair not long ago who says the world has got increasingly better in the last
well, but not as I agree with Stephen Pinker about that, but not as much better as it ought to have got if we had an all-powerful being.
But here's the interesting thing. That answer, I think, that question, of course, is raised right from the very, very beginning, because the first Christians who went out across the Roman world and began preaching the Christian message and saw Christians go from being 0.0008% of the Roman Empire to 51.2% in 312 years, they knew full well that Christians were thrown to the lions, that earthquakes happened, that disease happened, yet they still believed that God had come in the person of Jesus, risen from the dead, that was the death blow struck to evil, and that was the beginning of God's new creation and putting it all back together again.
A strange false belief, I think.
Well, interesting you say false belief. One of the things that intrigues me about the suffering question as well, and to go, this is a rabbit trail of its own, but I think it's a fascinating one. One of the things that began to intrigue me as I taught university level courses on the problem of evil was it's a peculiarly Western question. It's not that doesn't make it an irrelevant question, but when I would travel to the East, and I have many friends who are living in situations where they've experienced terrific suffering, persecution. I've met people who've lost their homes, their families, who've been tortured in prison for their Christian faith or experienced other things. These questions don't arise. It was pointed out after the tsunami, the Asian tsunami. It was Western newspapers that were running editorials with "Where is God?" That question wasn't being asked.
Well, because they don't really believe in that God that we believe.
Christians caught up in it would have been
Christians would have,
Muslims would have done. Those questions were not not being asked. And that just tells me something. I think it tells me that whilst this is not an unimportant question, we forget that we all ask our question from a position. We approach our philosophy from a position, and we're approaching this as Westerners. And I think there is something when you draw that lens back, similarly, historically, to go, if the problem of evil was such a spectacular argument against belief in a good God, then I think, as the Oxford professor C.S. Lewis famously asked, how did that belief ever arise in the first place? Men are crazy, but not as crazy as that. So I think we need to wrestle with the question, but I think it's actually a question for both atheists and for Christians to wrestle with, because it gets us to the issue.
I don't see why it's a question for atheists. I mean, we understand the world as having evolved from very simple beings that were not conscious. There's no plan to the world for an atheist evolutionary viewpoint. It's just happened through random mutations. And unfortunately, if you like, it's indifferent as to whether it causes suffering or not in terms of how things evolve. So I don't see why it's at all a problem for atheists that there is all this
explain
suffering.
why. I think if atheists were simply content to leave it there, that would be one thing. But the fact that when natural disasters happen, we find atheists quick to use moral language.
Why should? Of course, and I've never denied that we should use moral language.
So where does the ought-ness come from? It's just evolution doing her thing or his thing.
No,
or
it's
their
not
thing.
at all. Not at all. That would be the naturalistic fallacy, and that's why I said to Justin before, I'm not a naturalist. No, it's that we can understand as rational beings that gratuitous suffering is a bad thing, and that for beings to experience joy and pleasure and happiness is a good thing. And moral language follows from that. So I don't think there's any problem for an atheist in using moral language. And I think that problem, the problem of suffering, is therefore uniquely a problem for those who believe in a God who has these three attributes of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, or goodness.
Well, let me bring it back, not the issue of it not being a problem, Peter. You wrote, sorry, I was just digging in my iPad because I thought I actually wanted to read you something. You said, far from justifying principles that are shown to be natural, a biological explanation can be a way of debunking what seem to be eternal moral axioms. When a widely accepted moral principle is given a convincing biological explanation, we need to think again about whether we should accept the principle.
Yes, that's right. And so debunking explanation. That means we don't support the value that we might hold because it helped us to survive and reproduce. The fact that a value helped us to survive and reproduce doesn't prove that it's false, but should lead us to a certain skepticism.
Exactly. And in the same way that our instinctive reaction to when we see suffering in nature is, that's a terrible thing, we could debunk the same thing. In fact, A.J. Ayers, I think it was, who famously said, the debunker should be forced to wave his own debunking sword over his own cherished beliefs in public. And so I think actually evolution, when you apply it that way, becomes a universal asset.
I don't think it does. And I've argued, in fact, in a book called The Point of View of the Universe, that the idea of universal benevolence, the idea that, as the late 19th century utilitarian philosopher Henry Sidgwick said, from the point of view of the universe, the interests of each being count the same if they're similar sorts of interests. That's something that you cannot explain in evolutionary terms, why we should hold that belief, because it actually would be more advantageous to our survival and reproduction if we said, no, beings who are not any kin of mine or not in a reciprocal relationship with me, their interests don't count. And of course, a lot of people do actually act on that, and it's not surprising given that we are evolved beings who descended from ancestors who succeeded in reproducing. It's not surprising that we should have tendencies to act on that. And when you referred to the idea of human nature as being broken, I think it's simply something that we can understand in evolutionary terms, why we do not act with universal benevolence to all. But as rational beings, I think we can see that would be the right way to act. So I think that's an ethical principle that is not debunked by evolutionary explanations.
I'm less so sure. I'm less sure. I mean, it was interesting. You mentioned there's some of the in your last commentary on evolution there. One of my favourite. You mentioned Tom Nagel earlier. One of my other favourite iconoclastic philosophers is an Australian, was an Australian, the late David Stove, who wrote a wonderful book called Darwinian Fairy Tales, I think really doing a fantastic job of debunking attempts to use evolution to get us any form of ethics. But although he has a nice little language he uses there, that we continually, people who want to wed their belief system purely in evolution, continually keep applying patches to the theory to try and come up with why human beings are altruistic, because of course human beings seem to use altruism everywhere. On the other hand, you're criticising human beings for not displaying care sort of equally to all, but actually we have invented all kinds of ways of helping people who are not biologically connected to us. And if you're an evolutionary sociobiologist like E.O. Wilson, that causes you a tremendous headache. But one thing I think is interesting, I would like to pick you up on, is that a comment I made earlier about ethics and morality existing within relationships, and I think, of course, particularly where they exist is within familial relationships. So I think you've argued in several places that in theory there's no necessarily good moral reason for if there's a house on fire and you could rescue your biological offspring or rescue someone else's offspring, why you should pick your own child. But you admitted elsewhere that in the case of your daughters, if there was a house fire, you'd probably grab those who were your kith and kin and not the others.
I'm sure I would, because I'm also a human who is descended from others who've evolved to have these strong feelings.
My question is, I'm not
children.
necessarily convinced that's a bad thing, because I think one of the things we've been dancing around a little bit in this whole discussion is, of course, if you look at classical ethical theory, if you take this back to Aristotle and the such like, we get into the issues that ethics is about character. In fact, ethics comes from the Greek word ethos that means character, and for Aristotle and many others, the key question will be, how do we build citizens and human beings who have a certain kind of character? Both your earlier preference-based utilitarianism and now the hedonistic utilitarianism that you would say is your framework, and the idea of promoting good and avoiding pain. I was sitting there thinking about this last night while feeding my son banana and peanut butter. We believe in good nutrition.
Very good healthy meal for your
yes,
son.
He rejected the salad, and so this was the only thing we would get Christopher to eat 6:30 last night. But it suddenly occurred to me that in the context of my parenting relationship with my 3-year-old, sure, avoiding pain is certainly part of it. I shouldn't clobber him around the head with a frying pan when he puts his Lego bricks on the floor. But on the other hand, that is a remarkably thin ethic, because most of my parenting relationship with my son and my daughter is around how do I form them to be persons of character? How do I shape them and mould them, more so at first, and as they get older to the reins less tightly? Because success looks like, for me, not a child who's happy. Well, that's a good plan B or C, but a child who is good, a child who's noble, a child who is brave, a child who is self-sacrificial, all that long list, which would come under what the ancients called character. And I think one of my slight concerns with this whole kind of discussion is that we abstract ethics into this sort of zero-sum game of, adding up happiness points versus negative points, and the idea we should all be treating everybody absolutely equally, irrespective of our relationship to them, ignores those kind of familial settings, ignores the duty that we have to siblings, to spouses to whom we've made commitments, and so on and so forth. Ethics can't be abstracted from close relationships and from character.
Would you agree with that, Peter?
I agree with a great deal of that, yes. I certainly think we ought to bring up our children to have a good character, a good moral character in various ways, and not just to be happy in themselves, if you like, selfishly happy. And I think it's also possible that, in fact, bringing them up to have a good moral character is a good way for them to be happy and fulfilled, and there's some good psychological research that shows that. But I think the broader utilitarian framework that I hold can accommodate that, because we don't simply want to try to bring up everyone to be completely impartial between their own children and those of the children of strangers, because, in fact, we know that in order to have children who have good lives and are psychologically well-adjusted, bringing them up in a close and loving family relationship is the best way to do it. And, of course, there have been various experiments over the centuries to try to bring them up in a more abstract or communal way, and it seems they don't work particularly well, so they don't suit our nature. So as utilitarians, we can actually encourage people to be the kind of loving father that you obviously are, and to try to bring up your child to have a good moral character. And I think that's compatible with the broader utilitarian ideal of wanting people to be well-adjusted and live in a good society.
I often come across people, though, who are worried philosophically about where a strict utilitarian ethic leads you. And so, for instance, I know some of the things that people have objected to in terms of the points you've made on this. I think you once wrote regarding a utilitarian argument for euthanizing disabled children. When the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed. The loss of happy life for the first infant is outweighed by the gain of a happier life for the second. And I think a lot of people look at that and think, well, that makes sense in a utilitarian framework, but it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like we should be killing off a child A because child B that would replace it would be happier potentially.
Right. The statement that you read doesn't say that we should kill off that child. It says the total amount of happiness would be greater, which is not in itself a value judgment.
Okay.
And it's in the context of a discussion about two different views, both utilitarian, one of which is a view that says to maximize the total amount, including the happiness that would be experienced by beings who we would bring into the world who would not otherwise exist, as against what I call, and you're quoting from Practical Ethics, one of my books, what I call the prior existence view, which says we ought to focus on maximizing the happiness of those beings who either already do exist or will exist independently of anything we do. So in saying the total happiness will be greater, I'm not necessarily saying that's the right thing to do.
Okay.
I'm saying that's what is implied by this total view of happiness, and I'm leaving it open, at least at that point, as to whether that's the view we ought to follow or the one that is concerned with.
Andy says God did something about suffering. He sent Jesus. Okay, that was 2,000 years ago. The world is still full of cancer, famine, earthquakes, kids dying, animals suffering. Nothing fundamental changed. If an all-powerful being wants to fix suffering, he can fix it, instantly. No cross required, no centuries of waiting, no new creation coming later. Instead, we get an explanation that suffering is part of a broken world. But who designed that world? An all-knowing creator would have known exactly what would happen. An all-powerful one could stop it right now. You can't call that perfect love. Either God can't fix it, or he won't. And both options contradict the classic definition of God. So here's the question. If we can recognize suffering as wrong without appealing to a deity, what exactly is God adding to morality? Is ethics something handed down from above, or something we build through reason, empathy, and shared human experience? I want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you appreciate honest conversations like this, hit like, subscribe, and join the discussion.